So, famine, as I'm sure many of you know, is a hotly contested and politically loaded term. So rather than being objective, definitions of famine have always been manifold, and they embody specific assumptions about what causes famine, and more specifically, who or what is to blame. And I don't think that this notion is limited to famine by any means. And in very general terms, I think it's probably fair to say that we try to provide solutions to problems by diagnosing their root causes. And in saying this, I'm not suggesting that sorry, are you able to see my notes? You're not in slideshow mode, am I not? Oh, I'm sorry. Is that better? No? Sorry. Oh, sorry, it's because I've got notes up, so I'll just be moving through it manually. So I hope that's okay for people. So I think there's a twofold benefit of using historical methodology to think about global food insecurity. So the first is that it helps to situate the global food crisis in the present day in its historical context. And the second is that a historical approach allows us to critically analyze how different aspects of human experience are interconnected, and this includes the symbiosis between people and the natural world, which is not really a meaningful distinction in any case. So part of my research is about unpacking and contextualizing seemingly universal truths to understand why certain groups think and act the way that they do about famine. And I hope that in being critically aware of how different epistemologies have shaped our thinking and our actions, we can be more open to inclusive and sustainable ways of problem solving in the present. So my talk today compares how British state and non-state actors' understandings of famine influence their famine relief efforts in different geographical spaces in the 1870s. So specifically, I'm focusing on what I call two famine clusters. So the first, between 1873 to 1875, looks at the famines in the Indian Presidency of Bengal and the Ottoman province of Asia Minor. And the second cluster, from 1876 to 1879, looks at the El Nino Southern Oscillation megadrought famines in the Indian province of Madras and the North Chinese province of Shanxi. So broadly speaking, I'm using a comparative approach to emphasize the role of contingency, human decision-making, and historical context, and looking at why British famine relief advocates provided aid to some groups of people and not to others, and why their relief took the specific forms that it did in certain instances. And in the process, I argue that famine relief is complex, contested, and contingent. And as I show over the next few slides, famine relief isn't guaranteed or universal, but rather it's a culturally specific practice that reflects how the benefactor society both defines famine and understands its implications. But before all of that, I just want to outline the broader context of industrial globalization, which is happening in the 1870s, which was crucial in framing how British state and non-state actors thought about famine in other parts of the world at this time. So in this decade, a range of historical developments were converging, and it resulted in the consolidation of what was a truly global food and commodity market. So most notably, there were really rapid changes in communications technology, transport, and practices of state building, and the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 was particularly important in this process. And all of these factors helped to facilitate Anglo-imperial conquests of new lands, markets, and labor forces in other parts of the world. And as many of you will probably know, at this point in time, Great Britain held a preeminent position within the concert of Europe and within the world in general. And statesmen considered India, China, and the Ottoman Empire as interconnected spaces of critical strategic importance in the exercise of British power globally. So briefly, India at this point was the crown jewel of Britain's empire. It was a vital breadbasket for the entire empire, and it was a revenue base for bankrolling military campaigns and economic investments around the world. So in turn, the Ottoman province of Asia Minor was functioning as a crucial buffer zone against a potential Russian invasion of India in the context of the Anglo-Russian rivalry known as the Great Game. And at the same time, China was valued as a captive market for the British opium trade, and in turn, that trade was operating primarily out of the poppy fields of Bengal and Asia Minor. So what you have at this point is a precarious British world system, as John Darwin calls it, in which British statesmen were attempting to manage the rest of the world's human and material resources for its own benefit, with varying degrees of success. Pardon me. So within this context, when famines struck these states, they jeopardized both Britain's global commercial interests as well as the geopolitical stability of the Eurasian landmass. And it's significant to note as well that all three of these empires, so British, Ottoman, and Qing, had recently experienced very bloody and financially costly conflicts that had left their administrations somewhat weakened and vulnerable to famines. So these include the Indian Mutiny of 1857, the Crimean War, and particularly the Taiping Rebellion, which is estimated to have killed over 20 million people in China. So the Ottoman and Qing empires especially were teetering on the brink of bankruptcy at this time, partly because of these conflicts, and they were embroiled in a state of economic dependency on Anglo-European loans. So this kind of sets the backdrop for the famines themselves. But more importantly, it was agriculturalists who were most vulnerable to famines at this time. So in the 1870s, as with today, climatic extremes were a huge factor in famines, but they catalyzed crop failures. And it was the structural inequalities in human decision-makings that made subsistence crises into deadly famines. So in this respect, famine is both an extraordinary event and a structure that's embedded in society's everyday social, political, and economic processes. So by the 1870s, several factors related to the process of industrial globalization had severely compromised agricultural communities' ability to withstand famine in India, China, and Turkey. And these included Anglo-European imperial expansion, mounting agricultural taxes to deal with debts and loans, the increasing exploitation of natural resources, deficient infrastructure, and quite crucially, the exportation of surplus food stocks due to the forced transition of agriculture from subsistence farming to cash crops. So in short, the climatic crises such as the mega droughts of the late 1870s kind of created a perfect storm within this context, which imperial bureaucracies were often ill-equipped or unwilling to address. And the consequences of these famines, unsurprisingly, were catastrophic, and this is particularly true of the famines in the second cluster. And what happened, as I imagine with many more contemporary famines, is that there was a snowball effect because famine deaths combined with mass migration, consecutive years of drought, the slaughter of draft animals for food, and the sale of agricultural tools, so that even when the rains finally fell, it was almost impossible to sow crops for the coming harvest, which perpetuated the crises for even longer. So to put all of this in quantitative terms, 150,000 people died in the Asia Minor famine, and between 9.5 and 13 million people perished in the North China famine. So in the Indian context, the Bengal famine of 1874 stands out as an outlier in the history of colonial famine policy. And this is because, unlike in other Indian famines, the colonial government prioritized saving life over saving money. And part of the reason for that is because that they were terrified that if the state failed to meaningfully intervene in a famine, they would have a repeat of the Indian Mutiny, because this was only less than 20 years after that rebellion had occurred. But the state very quickly intervened in the market in 1874, which meant that the final death toll was estimated at 23 people. But unfortunately, this approach was too expensive in the eyes of the colonial government, and the new viceroy reverted to Britain's traditional famine relief policy, which was austere non-interventionism. And this led to the deaths of 5.5 million people in the South Indian famine of 1876 to 79. So the fact that both famines emerged in the wake of serious drought is important, but the difference between them is that the human decision-making, economic system, and colonial ideologies informed the state's famine relief responses in each context. And I think that Mike Davis, the Maverick scholar, makes a really good point in saying that agriculturalist laborers and artisans in the global south at this time, quote, died in the golden age of liberal capitalism, end quote, and in the process of being forcibly incorporated into the modern world system. However, you would not find many people in Victorian Britain who agreed with this assessment, and they didn't share the view that famines were a fatal side effect of industrial globalization and liberal imperialism, but rather two key assumptions about famine broadly dictated state and non-state actors' relief responses. So the first was that famines were a hallmark of impoverished and quote unquote uncivilized societies. And the second was that the free market, facilitated by intensive transport and communications infrastructure, would effectively prevent famines in the future. And these assumptions drew on several key strands of intellectual thought that were circulating in 19th century Britain, which included political economy, utilitarian philosophy, evangelical Protestantism, and Malthusianism. But as the previous slide reflects, these ideas often didn't translate neatly to contexts outside of Britain. But nevertheless, these discourses combined very powerfully in the context of famine relief to justify a kind of binary opposition between English benefactors and foreign famine victims, which echoed existing British views on poverty at home. So in this schema, the ideal English benefactor was above all, quote unquote, civilized, which meant that he was self-disciplined, pious, industrious, and sympathetic. But by contrast, the people that Britain sought to save from famine were seen as quote unquote uncivilized. So these elites often characterized famine victims in all four cases as idle non-Christians who required discipline and salvation to, achieve historical progress, as it were. And this distinction was absolutely crucial in animating British debates about famines in other parts of the world. And in a lot of the sources that I'm working with, which are both governmental and private records, it's very, very common to come across English observers criticizing Indian, Chinese, and Turkish famine victims for, and these are quotes here, for their apathy, indolence, ignorance, and superstition. So we need to understand Victorian famine relief in this period within the context of highly unequal global power relationships. And we also need to remember that however well-meaning their relief might have been, it was also a racist and paternalistic project to civilize starving people who were assumed to live in culturally backward and undeveloped countries. So a key part of this disciplinary function of famine relief was to encourage famine victims to become economically self-sufficient and to promote industrial development in these countries. And this objective often dovetailed quite neatly with British geopolitical aims, because developmental famine relief often helped to open up new commodity markets and made it easier to transport British troops across long distances. So after the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, Britain prided itself as a free trade nation, and it applied the logic of laissez-faire economics to colonial famine policies in India and famously in Ireland as well. So what this meant in practice was that the state refused to prohibit exports, manage grain prices, or import food to save famine victims' lives. And the basic purpose of this policy was to minimize state expenditure and to prevent colonized peoples from becoming dependent on state charity. However, as the economist Amartya Sen rightly pointed out, laissez-faire economics at this time didn't mitigate famines effectively because the market responded to people's purchasing power rather than the biological needs of starving people. So, by the 1860s, in India, colonial officials believed, drawing on their past experience, that famines were more problems of unemployment and debt-induced poverty rather than a deficient food supply. So subsequently, British efforts in Bengal and Madras in the 1870s reflected this by focusing on developing India's economy and infrastructure to kind of build society's resilience to future famines. So in both cases, state-run famine relief works on public utilities like railways, roads, and canals were a cornerstone of relief works. And they were a limited form of state intervention, which were justified in terms of providing employment. And they functioned to both expand India's market infrastructure, but also to discipline famine victims through manual labor in exchange for 2,500 calories worth of food, or the equivalent in cash wages. So in 1874, the colonial state and the Bengal presidency supplemented these relief works by intervening in the market. So they directly imported grain from primarily Myanmar. They offered a gratuitous grain dole for people who were unable to work, and they distributed agricultural loans to restart cultivation. But in stark contrast, in the Madras famine, this daily ration of 2,500 calories was slashed to 1,627 calories in order to save money. And this very controversial measure, known as the temple wage, massively increased mortality from starvation and also from disease, because the colonial government was determined that famine victims shouldn't rely on the government for assistance. And alongside all of these state efforts, or lack thereof, in the case of Madras, British missionaries were also providing famine relief, so their role was to purchase and distribute money, usually grain, but sometimes money, with funds that were raised in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, in the hope that, quote, the season of Darth may be a time of spiritual awakening, when the hungry, turning to Christ, may indeed be filled with good things, end quote. So in this sense, British famine relief efforts in Bengal and Madras sought to bring about India's quote unquote civilizational progress and development as both a bulwark against future famines and as a means of enhancing the colonial state's control in India. So in the Ottoman and Qing empires, there are similar discourses going on, but they manifest in very different relief efforts because Britain didn't exercise imperial jurisdiction in Asia Minor or Shanxi. So in both cases, Protestant missionaries were the primary distributors of British famine relief rather than state actors. And as a result, they were directly competing against both local philanthropists and state officials who already had their own relief mechanisms in place. So while Britain didn't have an imperial obligation to either Turkey or China as it did in India, non-state actors chose to intervene out of a sense of Christian duty or a desire to strengthen their existing commercial or political interests in these areas. So these relief efforts often took the form of distributing grain doles or cash, or setting up social services like soup kitchens, orphanages, and hospitals. And additionally, many relief agents, such as the Shanxi-based Baptist missionary, Timothy Richard, didn't hesitate to use famine relief as an opportunity to proselytize and to open up China and the Ottoman Empire to Christian influence. And this kind of informal coercion was also reflected by people who lived in the affected areas and would write to newspapers back in the United Kingdom. And they'd tend to use Britain as a model to point out flaws in the Ottoman and Qing government's relief efforts. So unlike in Britain, these states placed a very strong emphasis on benevolence as the distinguishing feature of good government, and this was particularly true of China. And accordingly, they took a much more interventionist role in famine relief than the Indian government did, even though they were constrained, as I said earlier, by financial and logistical problems. So both the Ottoman Sultan and the Qing Emperor redirected grain exports from around their respective empires and funneled them into the famine-affected regions at this time. And they also instructed state officials to defray tax collections. However, the English language presses in both Turkey and China were very critical of these measures. And they would take aim both at the states' interference with the laws of supply and demand, as well as their refusal to adopt British technology, commerce, and expertise as long-term solutions to famine. So to summarize, British famine relief was dictated by the culturally specific belief that industrial globalization and the so-called civilizing mission were the solutions to, rather than major causes of, distant communities' vulnerability to famine. So what can we take away from these historical examples of grappling with food insecurity? The first and perhaps the most fundamental is that comparing British relief responses in the 1870s shows that modes of understanding global food insecurity are both politically contingent and culturally specific. And as a result, our subjective understandings of why famines happen in particular instances directly influence our approaches to relieving or preventing them. The second is that famine relief, no matter how well intended, always takes place in a historical context of unequal power relations, whether that's between a benefactor and a recipient, or in the context of the enduring colonial dependency of the global South on the global North. And finally, that the food crisis, as I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you here, is a complex problem which requires nuanced and interdisciplinary responses. So while all of this may seem very cynical, I'm not trying to invalidate famine relief, and indeed it's very, very crucial, and the people who conduct it are doing amazing work. But what I'm trying to do is to emphasize the necessity of being critical about how specific worldviews and power relationships inform our humanitarian praxis. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Emma. It's really fascinating. And your research is going ahead far very quickly. It's really complex and it's really amazing. Thank you so much. I would like to just start with a very quick question and and ask you, how much do you feel then that despite all the historical records and the knowledge that we have, how much does history really inform our actions today? You know, is history just there and repeats itself, or are we learning, or do we not want to learn because things change and we just want to keep making the same mistakes?
That's a huge and complex question to start with. But thank you. I mean, history is distinct from the past in terms of history being the specific stories that we tell. So it always relies on cherry picking. I mean, you could be the best historian in the world, but you still have to be subjective in choosing which examples you want to use, which evidence you want to use. So in that sense, I think the uses and abuses of history is another political context that we have to think about when we're talking about how history impacts policy. So for example, I think that, I mean, I'm completely in awe of the work that food security organizations are doing. I think they're doing a brilliant job, but they don't tend to emphasize kind of the structural relationship between, colonialism, industrialization, and, the current moment. So I think, yeah, it's very subjective. So I think historians as well have been quite reticent to actually take a role in policy. I think.
You think because they don't get involved, or because they prefer not to get involved?
Well, I think there's, a lingering desire to say that, history is separate from politics. It's, it's honoring the people of the past, which, as it should. So I think, as I said in the presentation, I think what we can get out of it is more historical ways of thinking and the importance of contextualizing rather than copying and pasting specific examples from the past, which I think has been the approach up until now. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, more to talk, of course, but unfortunately a few people have to leave. But Paul also mentioned if you have come across Megan Vaughan's work.
I'll write that down.
Yes, I'll put it also in the email wrapping up today's seminar. But so it's Histories of Famine in Malawi, and John also had to leave for another meeting. But I would like to ask anyone who might have questions, comments. Dan, I'm sure you have a comment or a question if you're still there. Martin, anyone, please.
Well, I'll just say that was a fascinating talk, Emma. Thank you for that. I should also explain I'm one of two archaeologists in your audience. That Paul, who takes the question, is also an archaeologist. And one thing I wanted to ask you actually is that you provided really lucid account of how of how farmers locked into a cash crop world system of the difficult relationships they get with the concept of famine and so forth. And in the background of that is the concept of a small scale diversified farmer who's doing rather better. And I think that we all actually have that model somewhere of a small scale diversified farmer who's doing better. And for your period, do you think you have empirical evidence of kind of small scale diversified farmers, perhaps at some further distance from these world systems, that are actually doing better? Or is it a kind of assumption?
That's a very good question. I think it partly depends because, of course, you've got these different tiers of agriculturalists. So some are more, especially in China, some are more freeholding peasants, so they have greater control over what is done with their land. They're not necessarily subject to an independent landlord. So I think that's a big difference. And yeah, I think I don't have the empirical evidence at the moment, but from the secondary literature that I've read, it does seem that you know, those who were better off financially tended to have a greater say in what they produced, and were somewhat able to resist this push towards monocultures, because again and again you have these narratives of you know, people who are forced to convert to growing, say, opium or indigo or cotton instead of food supplies, because that's what, you know, what will give them greater profits. But of course, these are futures that are sold in advance, and then the market can be very vindictive. So yeah, socioeconomic status, I think, plays a big part.
Yeah, thank you. It's something that, I mean, within a number of I mean, I guess within our global food security group, there is this kind of assumption that diversification is good and so forth, and it would be nice but I think probably it's less substantiated than your work. You know what I mean? It's just a kind of flavor idea. It's easier to find examples of big monocultural things going wrong, and I guess they enter the documentary record easier too, because there's a lot of historical agents writing stuff about it. So, thank you.
No problem. Thank you. And that's something I'll look out for. So I'll keep you posted.
Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. But I guess also, Emma, as Martin was saying, in a way, and she was kind of alluding to, I guess we choose the examples from the past to fit the theories, right, of today's what we want to demonstrate, and therefore we disregard or highlight certain things other than others.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would anyone else like to ask a question, make a comment? Unfortunately, Dan is traveling, so he can't really talk, but he found it talk very fascinating. He says,
"Oh, thank you."
But anyone else who is able to, even write in the chat if you prefer, or open your mic, of course, and ask yourself or make a comment yourself, please. Anyone? No, nobody else, I guess. Oh, quiet. Emma, would you like to make any further comments or any additional bits in kind of, I mean, if I may, I want to ask you, what would you say that informs today sort of political decisions in terms of north, south, you know, the global south, and you know, how do we look at countries in economically underdeveloped, you know, etc. What, you know, it was really interesting what you were saying in terms of the sort of philosophical, ethical, religious, etc. What's the sort of the theme would you say today?
I don't really feel qualified to make any sweeping claims because I'm much less well read on, contemporary famines. But I think from what I can see and from what I read, it seems that, commercial interests are a huge driving factor on what's happening, and this push towards development, which is great in terms of increasing communities' resilience and self-sufficiency, but it's thought about in terms of how it can benefit investors primarily. And it, as I was saying in the presentation, it kind of reinforces these relationships of dependency because it's drawing on these same ideas about, we in, an international organization, we have the right to tell you how you should develop. And a lot of the time it doesn't sufficiently take note of the needs and both material and cultural of the people who they're trying to help. And I think humanitarian organizations and grassroots groups are making really important contributions in trying to mitigate that, but I think there's still a lot of disconnect between people working on the ground and the international organizations who are drawing on this kind of intellectual legacy of imperial thought effectively.
There's no real empowerment. That's one of the missing parts, really. And maybe we just try to survive, and if you sort of that's probably the common theme in most of the charities and organizations. Martin, did you have any?
Yeah, I was just going to make another just general observation that it's just something that a reflection really, and that is at one level, if one compares your period, Emma, with the challenge today, I mean, one thing that is still there except intensified is the global world system and the support of markets and drives to monoculture, and so and none of those dynamics, as we know, have got any more benign or anything. They've been intensified. But there's one thing that's really different, and I think it's not easy to see how to think about it. But if you look at, as you can imagine, within the food security group, the use of science to increase yields is a big discourse. And if you look at what's happened over the last 200 years, since the Second World War, the power of science to increase yields per acre just puts the earlier period into a flat line. You know what I mean? So within your period, you've got those world system dynamics that's still with us, but by comparison, it's a kind of flat line in terms of yields per acre. And now we have this extraordinary scientific ability to do strange things with yield. And the good thing about our group is it does have social sciences in it. As one argument say is, look, we can make massive yields now. What happened in the 70s isn't relevant because we can do this. We can triple the size of a wheat ear and so forth. And I think I just raised that because I don't think it's a sort of undigested issue. I mean, I don't because it's not relevant to your research because there weren't the massive yields. It's not something that
well, it's thank you for making that point. It's very, very interesting that you bring that up because it's at this point in time where the ethos of scientific philanthropy comes into play, but it's also the time when the study of meteorology in particular is kind of really systematized in empire. So it's like, how can we predict when famines are going to happen so that we can I mean, like it was accepted that famines would be an inevitable part of daily life in the empire, but how can we mitigate them to improve crop yields but it was more in the context of how can we limit the disruptions to agricultural tax collection effectively. So obviously very, very different stakes at play, but yeah, this is the time when kind of the scientific ethos is really coming into its own, so that really gets the ball rolling. So I think people who investigate that will be a really fascinating topic to talk about, you know, the origins of that idea and maximizing crop yields and things.
Thank you, Matt. Franziska has a comment.
Yes, thank you for a really insightful talk. I know very little of history, I have to confess. And I would agree from what you've discussed so far that prevention is better than cure. However, during an acute famine, there seems to be little alternative to active relief efforts, including, for example, large-scale food delivery. So based on what you've explained so far and your research into those power differentials, what is your top communication tip to better meet beneficiaries at eye level?
That's a good question. So I think mainly you're right to say that prevention isn't always possible, and that, you know, it's crucial that we do have these emergency responses that, you know, are able to take place. But what tends to happen, I think, during this period, I don't know about today, but I would assume so from what I've read, is that, you know, in the process of saving their life, you know, it's not actually responding to people's, you know, their cultural needs, their political needs. So, you know, you're keeping them alive, but what value does that life have when everything else is gone, is the argument that philosophers tend to make about this. So I think while I'm trying to draw attention to these power relationships, because I think that in being aware of them, you know, it helps to facilitate that dialogue of, you know, how can we best fulfill people's needs on the ground? How can we do it without perpetuating inequality? So just, yeah, being more self-conscious within that relationship, I think, is what I'm trying to drive at. So I hope that kind of answers your question. But it's a very good point to raise.
Thank you.
Thank you, Franziska. Anyone else would like to make a contribution, ask a question, or make a comment? No. And I would like to apologize. I think it's the sun, as I was saying at the beginning. It's an exceptionally good day. So I imagine a few people have gone out, and also exams time. But thank you so much, Emma. Unless anyone else has any more comments or questions, I would really like to thank you. It's been really, really great. And I would also love you to connect with the people who are here. I'm sure they will probably contribute to your research. I'll put you in touch with Martin, Paul.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you. I've just put my email in the chat.
Great.
If
Yes,
anybody
please.
has further
Wonderful.
questions or comments.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And the recording, once edited, and the slides, if you'll be happy to send them to me,
Yeah, sure.
will be on our page. So anyone who's missed it, the ones who enjoy the sun, can listen to it again. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been great. And yeah, I hope to see you next Friday, and hopefully the link will work properly. And have a good weekend. Thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.